They say your life flashes before your eyes when you die. Mine didn't. I only saw the sterile ceiling of a hospital room, taking my last breath entirely alone while my family celebrated my sister's wedding across town. When my heart finally stopped, I thought the misery was over. I was wrong. I jolted awake, gasping for air, only to find myself staring at my tiny 4-year-old hands. I had been given a second chance, but this time, I wouldn't spend my life begging for their affection. I packed my little backpack, walked out the door, and let them regret it. The monitor beside my bed didn't scream when my heart began to fail. It just let out a pathetic, rhythmic whimper that mirrored my 28 years of existence. It was a Tuesday evening in late November. Outside the frosted window of Seattle General Hospital, the city was alive with the bustling energy of the impending holidays. Inside my room, the air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of rubbing alcohol and the undeniable stench of an ending. My name was Claire Harding, or at least it had been for 28 miserable years. I was dying of a congenital heart defect, a condition that had been manageable in my youth. Had my parents, Thomas and Margaret Harding, bothered to authorize the surgical intervention recommended when I was 10, but the surgery would have conflicted with the regional equestrian championships, and my older sister, Isabella, was slated to win the blue ribbon. My health was an inconvenience. It had always been an inconvenience. As my vision blurred at the edges, my phone buzzed weakly on the bedside table. I didn't need to look at it to know what it was. It was a notification from social media. Isabella, radiant in a custom-designed Vera Wang gown, cutting an immaculate 6-tier cake with Noah, my former fiancé. My family, the prominent Harding dynasty, was gathered around them, their faces flushed with champagne and genuine joy. They hadn't visited me in 3 weeks. They had deemed my hospitalization another one of Claire's dramatic bids for attention. A sharp, agonizing pain ripped through my chest, radiating down my left arm. I tried to press the call button, but my fingers were numb. As the darkness encroached, a profound, bitter clarity washed over me. I had spent my entire life shrinking myself, apologizing for my existence, practically bleeding out on the floor just to earn a single scrap of validation from Thomas and Margaret. I had let them take my dignity, my inheritance, and eventually, the man I thought loved me. If I had another lifetime, I thought, the darkness finally pulling me under, I would never shed a single tear for them again. The long, agonizing beep of the flatline faded into an echoing silence. Then, an abrupt, violent rush of oxygen flooded my lungs. I sat up, gasping, coughing violently as if I had just breached the surface of an icy lake. My hands clutched my chest, expecting the familiar, tearing agony of my failing heart. But there was no pain. There was only the rapid, strong fluttering of a healthy, albeit tiny, heartbeat. I blinked against the sudden assault of bright, natural light. This wasn't the hospital. The sterile white walls were gone, replaced by a nauseating shade of pastel yellow. I stared at the carpet, thick, plush, and a pristine cream color. The scent of lavender and expensive floor wax hit my nose, a smell so intrinsically linked to my childhood trauma that it made my small stomach churn. Trembling, I lowered my gaze. My hands were tiny, plump, dimpled at the knuckles, and completely free of the IV bruising that had mapped my skin for the past month. I was wearing a pair of oversized baby blue pajamas with a cartoon rabbit on the front, panic and confusion warring in my mind. I scrambled out of the small bed. My legs felt unnaturally short, my center of gravity entirely different. I stumbled toward the full-length mirror attached to the heavy mahogany wardrobe in the corner of the room. The reflection staring back at me shattered whatever grip on reality I thought I had. A 4-year-old girl stood there. Her dark hair was tangled, her pale face dominated by wide, terrified blue eyes. It was me. I stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the mattress. My mind, sharp and cynical from 28 years of neglect and betrayal, spun wildly within the confines of a toddler's skull. This was impossible. Was this a dying hallucination? The final firing of synapses in a decaying brain? I bit down hard on my lower lip. The sharp, coppery taste of blood flooded my mouth, accompanied by a very real, very sharp sting of pain. Not a dream. I looked around the room, my adult mind rapidly cataloguing details that my child self had once ignored. The calendar on the wall, pinned next to a bookshelf filled with pristine toys I was rarely allowed to touch, read, October 2002. A cold dread settled in my gut as the date crystallized in my memory. The 14th of October 2002. I remembered this day vividly. It was the day the emotional neglect officially mutated into outright emotional abuse. It was the day of the vase incident. In my previous life, today was the day 6-year-old Isabella, running through the upstairs hallway, knocked over Margaret's prized Ming Dynasty replica vase. When it shattered, Isabella had frozen, terrified. But as soon as she heard our mother's sharp, angry footsteps ascending the stairs, Isabella had pointed a trembling finger at me, who had just stepped out of my room to see what the noise was. In that past life, I had cried. I had begged. I had screamed my innocence, clinging to my mother's skirt, desperate for her to believe me. Margaret had slapped me across the face the first time she ever hit me and dragged me by my arm to the dark, drafty attic room. Thomas had come home later, listened to Margaret's hysterical account of my malicious destruction, and decreed that the attic would be my new permanent bedroom. From that day on, I was the family scapegoat, the black sheep, the problem child. Down the hall, I heard the heavy thud of running footsteps. Netzlin echoed. The horrific sound of shattering porcelain echoed through the sprawling, silent house. I stood frozen in the center of my yellow bedroom. The timeline was intact. The event had just happened. My heart pounded against my ribs. But this time, it wasn't out of fear. It was out of cold, calculated realization. I was 28 years old. I knew exactly how this story ended if I played the same role. I wiped the drop of blood from my lip. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to beg. The silence that followed the crash was deafening, soon broken by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of Margaret's designer heels on the hardwood stairs. Isabella? Claire? What on earth was that? Margaret's voice was shrill, laced with an annoyance that was perpetually simmering just beneath the surface of her polished exterior. I walked out of my bedroom, my bare feet sinking into the hallway runner. Isabella stood amidst the shattered white and blue porcelain, her face pale, her hands trembling. She looked at me, her 6-year-old eyes wide with panic. In my past life, I had run to her, asking if she was okay. This time, I just stood there, my hands resting calmly at my sides, watching her with a gaze far too old for my small face. Margaret reached the top of the stairs. Her eyes widened as she took in the destruction of the expensive antique. The color drained from her perfectly contoured face, replaced by a violent, blotchy red. "My vase!" she shrieked, rushing forward. "My beautiful, irreplaceable vase! Who did this?" Isabella burst into manufactured tears. She turned, and just as she had 24 years ago, she raised a shaking finger and pointed directly at me. "It was Claire, Mommy," Isabella sobbed, throwing her arms around Margaret's waist. "She was running and she pushed it. I tried to stop her, I really did." Margaret's head snapped toward me, her eyes flashing with a familiar, terrifying fury. She untangled herself from Isabella and marched toward me, her hand raised. I didn't flinch. I didn't cower. I didn't open my mouth to deny it. I just looked up at her, my expression completely blank. I stared directly into my mother's eyes and saw the sheer lack of love there. It wasn't that she didn't know how to love. She loved Isabella fiercely. She just didn't love me. Seeing it now, with the maturity of an adult who had died alone because of this woman's negligence, the realization didn't hurt. It simply liberated me. Margaret's hand paused in mid-air, faltering slightly under my dead, unwavering stare. It unnerved her. I could see the hesitation in her posture. "You did this," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. You malicious, destructive little brat. Yes, I said. My voice was high-pitched, a toddler's soft timbre, but my tone was flat, devoid of any childlike inflection. I did it. Margaret blinked, visibly taken aback by the immediate, emotionless confession. She had expected a tantrum, tears, a denial she could crush. My calm compliance threw her off balance. You did? She stammered, before her anger flared again to cover her confusion. Do you have any idea how much that cost? Your father is going to be furious, Claire. Furious! Go to your room immediately. We will deal with you when he gets home. You are going to be severely punished for this. Okay, I said quietly. I turned my back on her, ignoring the incredulous gasp she let out at my sheer indifference. I walked back into the yellow nursery and closed the door with a quiet, firm click. I locked it. I didn't have much time. Thomas would be home in 2 hours. By the time he walked through the front door, I intended to be gone. If I stayed, I knew my fate. A lifetime of psychological torture, culminating in a lonely death. The state wouldn't take a child away from the wealthy, influential Harding family based on emotional neglect. If I wanted out, I had to extract myself. I had to disappear. I pulled my pink heavy-duty canvas backpack from the closet. It was meant for my first day of preschool, a day Margaret had already decided I would skip because she had a spa appointment. I unzipped it and began to work with methodical precision. Clothes. I packed 3 sets of warm clothes, thick sweaters, sturdy jeans, and an extra pair of sneakers. The Seattle autumn was unforgiving. Next, survival. In a house this massive, it was easy for a child to go unnoticed. I slipped out of my room, bypassing the front staircase, where I could hear Margaret still loudly comforting Isabella. I crept down the back servants' stairs, moving like a ghost. I entered the massive kitchen, currently empty, as the private chef wouldn't arrive until 4 o'clock. I grabbed 2 bottles of water, a box of high-calorie granola bars, and a jar of peanut butter, stuffing them into my bag. Then came the most critical part of my plan. I needed resources. I was a 4-year-old girl. I couldn't exactly hail a cab or check into a hotel. I needed leverage, and I needed identity. I snuck down the hallway to Thomas's home office. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. Thomas Harding was a meticulous man, a high-powered corporate attorney, but he had one glaring flaw: hubris. He believed his home was his impenetrable fortress, and he never locked his private safe during the day if he was expecting to return and work in the evening. I slipped behind his massive mahogany desk. The safe was built into the lower cabinetry. I tugged the heavy steel door. It opened smoothly. Inside, stacked neatly, were the documents of our lives. I bypassed the stock certificates and the property deeds. I reached into the back and found the thick leather folder containing our vital records. I pulled out my birth certificate, the official document proving I was Claire Harding. I also took my brand new passport, recently issued for a family trip to Paris that I had ultimately been excluded from. Next to the folders was a thick stack of emergency cash, $100 bills bound in paper straps. Thomas kept it there for unforeseen inconveniences. I took one strap, $10,000. It was a fortune, but to Thomas, it was pocket change. He wouldn't notice it was gone until he did an audit, and by then, it wouldn't matter. I shoved the cash, the passport, and the birth certificate deep into the bottom of my pink backpack. I was ready. I returned to my room, threw on my heaviest winter coat, a dark navy blue peacoat that Margaret hated because it wasn't feminine enough, and strapped the surprisingly heavy backpack onto my small shoulders. I grabbed a pink crayon and a piece of expensive, embossed Harding family stationery from my play desk. I had to leave a message, not out of spite, but to ensure they understood the gravity of the situation, to delay them from calling the police as a simple missing child case. I needed them confused. I needed them terrified of a scandal. With the clumsy, uncoordinated grip of a 4-year-old, but the precise intent of an adult. I wrote in large, blocky letters, I broke the vase. I am bad. I leave now. So Isabella is the only daughter. Do not look. Goodbye. I placed the note squarely in the center of my neatly made bed. Outside, the infamous Seattle rain had begun to fall, a steady, cold drizzle that slicked the pavement and cast a grey pall over the upscale Mercer Island neighborhood. The timing was perfect. In an hour, the driveway would be filled with the luxury cars of my parents' friends arriving for a dinner party. The chaos of catering staff and arriving guests would provide the ultimate cover. I waited in the mudroom near the back entrance. At 5:30 p.m., the catering van pulled into the service driveway. As two men in white uniforms struggled with heavy trays of hors d'oeuvre, propping the heavy oak side door open, I slipped out behind them, completely unnoticed. The cold air hit me like a physical blow, biting through my jeans and chilling my face. The rain plastered my dark hair to my forehead. But as I took my first steps down the long, winding driveway, away from the imposing brick facade of the Harding estate, a profound sense of euphoria washed over me. I was free. I was small, vulnerable, and soaking wet, but I was out. My destination wasn't random. I wasn't running away to live on the streets. I had a target. Grandma Ruth. Ruth Harding, Thomas's mother. In my previous life, she was the only person who had ever shown me an ounce of genuine affection. She used to sneak me hard candies and tell me I was smart. But she had passed away when I was 6, leaving me completely alone in the dark. Now, it was 2002. Grandma Ruth was alive, living in a highly secure, upscale, independent living community just 3 miles away in Bellevue. 3 miles for an adult is a brisk walk. 3 miles for a 4-year-old, in the rain, is an expedition. I kept to the shadows of the tree-lined streets, avoiding the main roads. My small legs ached almost immediately. The backpack felt like a boulder dragging me down. But the memory of the hospital ceiling, the flat line, the sheer apathy of my family that fueled me. Every step away from them was a step toward a life I would control. An hour passed. The sky bruised into a deep purple, then faded to a wet, inky black. I was shivering violently now, my teeth chattering. I had reached a busy intersection near the Bellevue border. The lights of a local diner spilled out onto the wet pavement. I needed an adult. I couldn't walk into Grandma Ruth's gated community on foot. Security wouldn't let a toddler wander in. I needed an escort, someone with authority. Through the diner window, I spotted a familiar sight. A local police officer sitting at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee. I checked his shoulder patch through the glass. City of Mercer Island Police. I took a deep breath, mentally preparing myself. I had to play the part perfectly. I couldn't act like a 28-year-old trapped in a child's body. I would be committed to a psychiatric ward, or worse, handed right back to Thomas as a disturbed child. I had to act like exactly what I appeared to be. A terrified, abandoned 4-year-old. I pushed the heavy diner door open. The bell jingled loudly. The warm air inside smelled of grease and stale coffee. I walked in, shivering uncontrollably, dripping rainwater onto the linoleum floor. The officer turned. His name tag read Jenkins. His eyes widened as he took in the sight of a tiny girl in a soaking wet peacoat and a pink backpack, alone in the dark. "Hey there, little one," Jenkins said, his voice instantly softening. He set his coffee down and quickly slid off his stool, crouching down to my eye level. "Where are your parents, sweetheart? Are you lost?" I let the physical exhaustion and the cold take over. I forced tears to well up in my eyes, my lower lip trembling perfectly. "I'm not lost," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "I left," Jenkins frowned, concern etching deep lines into his forehead. "You left? Why did you leave, honey? What's your name?" "Claire," I sniffled, clutching the straps of my backpack. "Claire Harding. I was bad. I broke the vase. Mommy said I was malicious and bad, and Daddy was going to punish me severely. I didn't want to be locked in the dark room again. So I left. So Isabella can be the only daughter. Jenkins's expression froze. The name Harding carried weight in this town, but the words coming out of my mouth carried a darker, more disturbing weight. He noticed the absolute lack of childish confusion in my statement. He heard the exact repetition of adult threats. Malicious, punish severely, locked in the dark room. They locked you in a dark room, Claire? He asked, his voice dropping an octave. A hardened, professional edge creeping in. I nodded slowly, letting a single tear track down my cold cheek. The attic, it has spiders. I'm scared of the attic. Can you please take me to my Grandma Ruth? She lives at the Oakwood home. She likes me. She won't lock me away. Jenkins stood up, pulling his radio from his belt. Dispatch. This is Unit 4. I have a found child at the diner on 4th. Claire Harding. Age, roughly 4. Requesting a welfare check at the Harding residence. Actually. Hold that. Let me make a call first. Child is requesting to be taken to a relative. He looked down at me, his jaw set tightly. I'm going to get you dry, Claire. And we're going to go see your grandma. Back at the Harding estate, the dinner party was in full swing. Jazz music wafted from the parlor, mingling with the clinking of crystal glasses and the pretentious laughter of the city's elite. Margaret Harding excused herself from a conversation with a prominent judge to check on the caterers. As she passed the main staircase, she frowned, realizing she hadn't seen or heard a peep from me since the vase incident 3 hours ago. Usually, by now, I would be crying, begging to be let out, scratching at the door. The silence was unnatural, annoyed. She marched up the stairs, intending to deliver a cold plate of dinner and a stern lecture before Thomas got around to the real punishment. She reached the nursery door. "Claire!" she snapped, rattling the handle. "Unlock this door immediately." No answer. Claire Harding. "If I have to get the key, you will be very sorry." Silence. Muttering under her breath about ungrateful, stubborn children, Margaret went to the hall closet, retrieved the master key, and shoved it into the lock. She pushed the door open, ready to yell. The words died in her throat. The room was pristine. The bed was perfectly made. The closet door was ajar, revealing an empty space where my winter coat and backpack usually hung. Margaret stepped into the room, her heart suddenly seizing with a strange, unfamiliar panic. It wasn't the panic of a mother terrified for her child's safety. It was the panic of a control freak who realizes a vital piece of her controlled environment is missing. She walked over to the bed and saw the pink crayon note. She picked it up, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as she read the blocky, childish handwriting. "Do not look. Goodbye." "Thomas!" Margaret screamed, dropping the paper as if it burned her. The sound tore through the quiet upstairs hallway, shrill and hysterical enough to cut through the jazz music below. "Thomas! Get up here now!" Thomas Harding took the stairs 2 at a time, his face flushed with anger at the interruption of his networking. "Margaret, what is the meaning of this?" He stopped in the doorway, seeing his wife clutching her chest, staring at the empty room. "She's gone," Margaret whispered, her eyes wide. "The little brat actually ran away." Thomas scowled, snatching the note from the bed. He read it, his expression darkening into a storm of fury. Ridiculous. She's 4 years old. She's probably hiding in the gardens to get attention. Get the staff to search the grounds quietly. I will not have my daughter causing a scene while the mayor is downstairs. "Thomas? Her coat is gone. Her backpack is gone. Then she's in the playhouse." Thomas snapped, turning on his heel. "I'll go check my office. Make sure she didn't lock herself in there again." Thomas strode down the hall and entered his dark study. He flipped on the light. The room appeared untouched, but as he walked around his desk, his polished shoes stopped dead. The cabinet door concealing his safe was wide open. A cold sweat broke out on the back of Thomas's neck. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the crease in his tailored trousers. He pulled the steel door open fully. The stack of emergency cash was disturbed. The strap of $10,000 was gone. He ripped the leather document folder out, his hands shaking violently now. He flipped through the thick, expensive paper. Property deeds, stock certificates, Isabella's birth certificate. Claire's birth certificate was missing. Her passport was missing. Thomas sank back onto his heels, the air leaving his lungs in a rush. This wasn't a child throwing a tantrum and hiding in the bushes. A 4-year-old doesn't know to take vital records. A 4-year-old doesn't take untraceable cash. The realization hit him like a freight train, cold and absolute. His 4-year-old daughter hadn't just run away. She had systematically, cleanly, and permanently erased herself from their lives. And he suddenly realized, with a rising, choking terror, that he had no idea who was actually in the body of the little girl he had treated with such cruel indifference. The drive to Bellevue was a blur of neon lights bleeding through the rain-slicked windows of the police cruiser. Officer Jenkins had wrapped me in a scratchy, wool emergency blanket. The heater blasted against my frozen legs, slowly thawing the ice in my veins, but the chill in my soul remained. I stared out the window, my mind a steel trap, calculating the next moves. Grandma Ruth wasn't just a sweet old lady who knitted sweaters. Before she married my grandfather, she had been one of the first female executives at a major Seattle logistics firm. She was sharp, pragmatic, and possessed a bullshit detector that my father, Thomas, deeply feared. The Oakwood independent living community was a fortress of manicured lawns and high security. Jenkins flashed his badge at the gate, and we pulled up to the main lobby. It was past 8:00 p.m. The halls were quiet, smelling faintly of lavender and floor wax, a comforting contrast to the sterile opulence of the Harding estate. Jenkins carried me down the carpeted hallway to apartment 4B. He knocked softly, then louder. A moment later, the door swung open. Ruth Harding stood there, leaning heavily on a silver-handled cane. At 72, she was a formidable presence. Her silver hair was cut in a sharp bob, and her piercing grey eyes, the same eyes I saw in the mirror, every morning swept over the towering police officer and the dripping wet toddler in his arms. "Officer?" Her voice was a raspy alto, completely devoid of the frailty one might expect. "Mrs. Harding, I'm Officer Jenkins. Mercer Island, PD. I believe this is your granddaughter, Claire. She walked into a diner on 4th Avenue about an hour ago, alone. She explicitly asked for you." Ruth's gaze dropped to me. For a split second, I saw raw, unadulterated shock fracture her composed exterior. Then, she stepped aside, pulling the door wide. "Bring her in, now." Jenkins set me down on a plush velvet sofa in her warmly lit living room. He quickly summarized what I had told him. The broken vase, the attic, the threats of severe punishment, the desire to leave so Isabella could be the only daughter. As he spoke, Ruth's jaw tightened until the skin around her mouth turned white. She walked over to the small kitchenette, poured a glass of warm milk, and brought it to me. Her hands, speckled with age spots, were remarkably steady. "Claire, darling," Ruth said, her voice dropping to a low, intense murmur. "Did Thomas or Margaret put their hands on you today?" I looked up at her. I had to play this perfectly. If I told the truth that Margaret hadn't hit me yet, but had locked me away and would have let Thomas do the rest, it might not be enough for a permanent break. But I also couldn't lie in a way that could be disproven. Mommy yelled. "She said I was malicious," I whispered, clutching the warm glass. "Daddy said the attic is my room forever." "I don't want the attic, Grandma. It's cold." Ruth closed her eyes for a long, heavy second. When she opened them, the grandmotherly warmth was gone, replaced by the ruthless executive who had built a corporate empire. "Officer Jenkins," Ruth said, turning to the cop. "I want to file a formal report. Child neglect and emotional abuse. I am taking immediate temporary physical custody of my granddaughter. Thomas Harding is a high-powered attorney. If he gets wind of this before we have paperwork filed, he will use his connections to bury it and drag her back to that house to save face. Jenkins nodded slowly. Mrs. Harding, I have to inform the parents of her whereabouts. It's protocol. Inform them, Ruth commanded, her tone brokering no argument. But inform them that she is in my custody. And if they step foot on this property tonight, I will have them arrested for trespassing. And Jenkins? Tell them she's sleeping. After Jenkins left, the apartment fell into a heavy silence. Ruth sat in the armchair opposite me, watching me intently. You're a very smart girl to find that diner, Claire, she said quietly. But you didn't walk 3 miles in the rain with just a broken heart. She eyed the heavy pink backpack resting by my feet. I knew I couldn't hide it from her. She needed to understand the absolute finality of my decision. With my small, clumsy hands, I unzipped the bag. I bypassed the granola bars and pulled out the thick leather document folder, laying it on the coffee table. Then, I pulled out the paper strap of $100 bills, $10,000 in crisp sequential bills. Ruth's breath hitched. She stared at the money, then at the birth certificate and passport poking out of the folder. I took my things, I said, my voice dropping the childish inflection entirely, ringing with an eerie adult calmness. I am not going back, Grandma. Ever. Ruth stared at me, the silence stretching until it felt thick enough to choke on. She didn't scream. She didn't scold me for stealing. She looked at the meticulously gathered survival kit of a child who had accepted that she had no parents. She saw the absolute, terrifying resolve in my 4-year-old eyes. A single tear slipped down Ruth's wrinkled cheek. She reached out and placed her hand over my tiny, cold fingers. No, Ruth whispered fiercely, her grip tightening like a vice. No, you are not. Let Thomas try to take you. I will burn his entire world to the ash before I let him put you back in that dark room. The fallout the next morning was swift and brutal. Thomas Harding was a man who operated on control. Losing me was a minor inconvenience. Losing control of the narrative was a catastrophe. At 8:00 a.m., my grandmother's phone rang. I was sitting at her small dining table, eating a plate of scrambled eggs, watching the rain beat against the glass. Ruth picked up the receiver, her face an unreadable mask. "Hello, Thomas," she said. Her voice was ice. I couldn't hear his exact words, but the cadence of his voice bleeding through the receiver was frantic, laced with poorly concealed rage. He was demanding, he was threatening, he was trying to assert dominance. "You will do no such thing," Ruth interrupted smoothly. "Claire is with me. She will remain with me," more shouting from the other end. "Steal?" Ruth let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Thomas, are you honestly accusing your 4-year-old daughter of cracking your office safe? If you want to put that on a police report, be my guest. I'm sure the Seattle Times would love to run a front-page story about the brilliant Thomas Harding being robbed blind by a toddler in footed pajamas." Silence on the other end. She had him pinned. If he admitted the money and documents were missing, he either had to claim a 4-year-old outsmarted his security, or admit he was careless enough to leave his most sensitive documents out in the open, a fatal flaw for an attorney managing billions in trust funds. "I have already contacted Jonathan Brooks," Ruth continued, dropping the name of the most vicious, unyielding family law attorney in the Pacific Northwest, a man who had famously dismantled 2 sitting senators in divorce court. "We are filing for an emergency order of protection and temporary guardianship based on severe emotional neglect and unfit living conditions." "The attic, Thomas? Really? Mother, you are being hysterical." Thomas's voice finally came through clearly, dripping with condescension. "Margaret was upset about an antique. We discipline our children. You cannot steal my daughter because of a time-out." "It wasn't a time-out, Thomas. It was an erasure. And as of this morning, she is my ward." Ruth slammed the phone down onto the receiver. The legal battle that followed was a masterclass in corporate warfare, applied to family court. Thomas tried to use his weight, but Ruth was a ghost from his past, possessing intimate knowledge of the Harding family's skeleton closets. During the closed-door emergency hearing, Thomas and Margaret sat across from us. Margaret looked immaculate in a navy Chanel suit, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue, playing the distraught mother. Thomas was rigid, exuding furious authority. I sat beside Ruth, wearing a simple, clean dress she had purchased that morning. I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I simply stared at my hands. When the judge, a stern-faced woman named Judge Wallace, asked me if I wanted to go home with my mummy and daddy, I looked up. I didn't throw a tantrum. I looked directly at Thomas, channeling every ounce of the 28 years of apathy he had shown me in my past life, and said, in a perfectly flat voice, "They aren't my mummy and daddy. They only have Isabella." The chill that swept through the courtroom was palpable. Margaret gasped, a genuine sound of shock. Thomas's jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth would shatter. Jonathan Brooks, our lawyer, didn't hold back. He didn't focus on the broken vase. He focused on the medical records he had subpoenaed, records showing that while Isabella had seen a pediatrician 12 times in the last year for minor sniffles and equestrian physicals, I hadn't had a checkup in 2 years. He presented architectural blueprints of the Harding estate, highlighting the unheated, unfinished attic room, complete with photos Jenkins had taken during his welfare check. Thomas's defense crumbled. He couldn't risk a public trial that would expose his domestic negligence to his corporate board. He was a man who preached family values to his conservative clients. A scandal involving locking a toddler in a freezing attic would ruin his bid for senior partner. Cornered, Thomas did the only thing a man like him could do. He cut his losses. He signed the temporary guardianship papers, framing it to the judge as a temporary arrangement to allow tensions to cool and for Claire to bond with her grandmother. He saved face legally, but in that courtroom, the truth was laid bare. He was throwing me away. As we walked out of the courthouse, Thomas caught my arm. His grip was painfully tight. He leaned down. His voice, a venomous whisper meant only for me. "You think you've won? You little freak. You're a Harding. You have nothing without my name." I looked up into his furious, embarrassed eyes. I remembered dying alone. I remembered Isabella's wedding. "Keep the name. Thomas," I whispered back. "I'm going to take everything else." He recoiled as if I had burned him. I turned and walked away, my small hand firmly clasped in Grandma Ruth's. Time is a strange weapon. To a child, a decade is an eternity. To an adult reborn in a child's body, a decade is simply the incubation period for a meticulously planned strike. From 2002 to 2014, the world moved exactly as I remembered it. The financial crash of 2008, the boom of the tech industry, the rise of social media. I lived with Ruth in a comfortable, quiet existence. To the outside world, I was a quiet, highly gifted child who skipped 3 grades and possessed an unnerving talent for mathematics and market analysis. To Ruth, I was her partner. When I was 8, I started subtly pointing out stocks. I told her I had read about them in a magazine. By the time I was 10, during the onset of the 2008 housing crisis, I practically begged her to short the financial sector and heavy invest in a fledgling fruit logo tech company and a bizarre new online bookstore based out of our very own Seattle. Ruth, bless her ruthless corporate heart, didn't coddle me. She recognized the unnatural accuracy of my guesses. She set up a blind trust in my name, funneling the $10,000 I had taken from Thomas's safe, which we jokingly called my severance package, into the market. By the time I was 16, I had legally emancipated myself, a quiet legal maneuver handled by Jonathan Brooks. I was a multimillionaire in my own right, operating entirely in the shadows through shell LLCs managed by Ruth. Meanwhile, the Harding dynasty was beginning to crack under its own weight. Thomas had made senior partner, but his arrogance blinded him. Without the benefit of hindsight, he had heavily invested his personal wealth and the firm's capital into commercial real estate, just before the 2008 crash. He survived, but the family fortune was deeply leveraged. Margaret spent her time managing Isabella's social calendar. Isabella grew up exactly as I remembered. Stunningly beautiful, profoundly spoiled, and incredibly reckless. Without me there to serve as the family scapegoat, Isabella absorbed all of Margaret's neurotic pressure. By the time she was 18, she had crashed 3 sports cars and required 2 quiet, highly expensive stints in luxury rehabilitation centers in Malibu to cover up a spiraling substance abuse problem. Thomas bled money to keep Isabella's name out of the press. He needed a massive win to stabilize his firm, Caldwell and Hayes, and secure his legacy. That win was supposed to be the acquisition of a revolutionary biotech startup called Ethelgard Solutions. Ethelgard held patents for a new, non-invasive cardiac monitoring system. Ironically, the exact type of technology that might have saved my life in my previous existence. Thomas's firm was brokering the acquisition for a massive pharmaceutical conglomerate. If the deal went through, Thomas's commission and subsequent board seat would solidify his power for the rest of his life. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October. I was sitting in my private office in downtown Seattle. I was 16, but I wore a tailored grey suit that aged me up, and my demeanor was that of a seasoned veteran. My computer screen glowed with the complex, interlaced ownership structures of Ethelgard Solutions. The door opened, and Ruth walked in. She was 84 now, moving a bit slower, but her eyes were just as sharp. "The final shareholder meeting for the Ethelgard acquisition is scheduled for Friday," she said, taking a seat across from my desk. "Thomas has secured the votes of the visible board. He thinks it's a done deal. He's already shopping for a new yacht." I smiled, a thin, cold curving of my lips. Thomas didn't know that over the last 3 years, through a labyrinth of shell companies, Vanguard Holdings, Apex Capital, and finally, a quiet little LLC called Attic Investments, I had been aggressively buying up Ethelgard's unvested, quiet shares from desperate early-stage developers. "He needs a 60% majority to force the hostile takeover," I murmured, tapping my pen against the mahogany desk. "He currently has 54%. And Attic Investments?" Ruth asked, a feral, delighted gleam in her eye. "Attic Investments holds 38%, I replied. "The remaining 8 is scattered. I am the majority blocking shareholder." Thomas was walking into a trap he couldn't even see. He had spent 12 years forgetting I existed, convinced I was a broken, discarded piece of his past living off my grandmother's charity. He didn't know that the little girl he had locked in the dark had spent the last 12 years building a guillotine. "It's time, Grandma," I said, standing up and looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Seattle skyline. "Call Jonathan Brooks. Tell him we're attending the Ethelgard shareholder meeting on Friday. In person." Ruth let out a soft, elegant laugh that sent shivers down my spine. "Oh, Claire," she whispered. "Let them regret it." The Ethelgard Solutions shareholder meeting was held in the primary conference room of Caldwell and Hayes, an opulent, glass-walled space that overlooked the steel and grey expanse of Puget Sound. The room smelled of expensive cologne, freshly brewed espresso, and predatory anticipation. Thomas Harding sat at the head of the massive mahogany table. At 48, he looked every bit the master of the universe. His bespoke suit was perfectly tailored, his silvering hair meticulously styled. He was flanked by the existing board members of Ethelgard, mostly aging tech developers who had been blinded by the sheer volume of cash. Thomas's pharmaceutical buyer was dangling in front of them. "Gentlemen," Thomas began, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone that commanded the room. "The acquisition by the conglomerate is ready for final authorization. We hold 54% of the voting shares in this room. We will initiate the vote to force the sale, effectively cashing out the minority holdouts. This is a historic day for Ethelgard, and frankly, a highly profitable one for all of us." He smiled, a wolf baring its teeth. He reached for his gold Mont Blanc pen to sign the initiation docket. The heavy oak doors of the conference room swung open. The low hum of conversation died instantly. Thomas's head snapped up, a scowl forming on his face at the interruption. His secretary had strict orders not to let anyone in, but it wasn't his secretary. Grandma Ruth walked in, moving with a slow, deliberate elegance, leaning slightly on her silver-handled cane. Despite being 84, she commanded the room the moment she crossed the threshold. Thomas stood up, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "Mother, what on earth are you doing here? This is a closed corporate proceeding. Security should never have let you up here." "Security knows better than to stop a major shareholder, Thomas," Ruth said smoothly, taking a step aside. That was when I walked into the room. I was 16 years old. I wore a tailored charcoal grey suit, my dark hair pulled back into a severe, sleek knot at the nape of my neck. I carried a slim leather briefcase. I looked nothing like the terrified 4-year-old who had vanished into the rain 12 years ago. I looked like an executioner. Thomas stared at me. For a long, agonizing moment, he simply didn't compute who I was. The disconnect in his brain was palpable. He had spent over a decade erasing me from his mind, convincing himself that the daughter who ran away was a mere footnote in his grand life. "Who is this?" one of the Aethelgard board members asked, looking between Thomas and me. "My name is Claire Harding," I said. My voice was calm, perfectly modulated, echoing slightly in the cavernous room. "I am the managing director of Attic Investments." Thomas flinched as if I had struck him. The colour completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, ashen grey. "Claire?" he breathed, the word barely escaping his throat. Then, the second part of my sentence hit him. "Attic Investments? No, that's a shell corporation. The owner is anonymous. The owner was a miner whose assets were managed in a blind trust by Ruth Harding." I corrected smoothly, walking toward the table. I didn't take a seat. I stood at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, staring directly down the center at him. Upon my recent legal emancipation, I assumed full control. Attic Investments holds 38% of Aethelgard Solutions' unvested shares, acquired systematically over the last 36 months from your disgruntled early-stage engineers. The room erupted into shocked murmurs. The board members frantically began whispering to one another, looking at their own legal counsels. "This is a trick," Thomas sneered, his panic masking itself as fury. He slammed a hand on the table. "This is a stunt. You don't have the capital. You're a child." I unlatched my briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of certified legal documents. I tossed them onto the polished wood. They slid perfectly down the length of the table, stopping just inches from his gold pen. "Certified Share Registry, Thomas," I said, dropping the title of father. Entirely. I hadn't called him that in 12 years. Fully authenticated by the SEC. Thomas stared at the papers. His hands began to tremble. He didn't need to read them to know I was telling the truth. The sheer, calculated audacity of it, the name Attic Investments alone, told him everything he needed to know. This was a 12-year-long vendetta, executed with surgical precision. "You hold 38%, Thomas said, his voice dropping to a desperate rasp. "You still don't have a majority. I have 54. I can force the vote." "You could," I agreed, a cold smile touching my lips, "if you actually had 54. But you see, you assumed the remaining 8% was scattered among silent, neutral parties." I turned my gaze to two of the older board members sitting to Thomas's right, Dr. Aris and Dr. Chen, the original founders of Aethelgard. They had been entirely silent since I walked in. "Dr. Aris, Dr. Chen." I addressed them directly. "You built this cardiac technology to save lives. Thomas Harding intends to sell it to a conglomerate that will bury the patent for 10 years because it competes with their existing highly profitable invasive surgical division. Have you reviewed the addendums I sent you last night?" Dr. Aris, a grey-haired man with kind eyes, nodded slowly. He looked at Thomas with profound disgust. "We reviewed them, Miss Harding. You were right. They planned to shelve the tech. "What are you doing?" Thomas hissed at them, panic finally breaking his polished veneer. "We have an agreement. Our agreement was based on the technology going to market, Thomas," Dr. Chen said coldly. "We withdraw our proxy votes from your block. We are voting with Attic Investments." The math shifted in an instant. The room went dead silent. Thomas Harding no longer had 54%. He had 46. I had 46. It was a deadlock. "The motion to force the sale is denied," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "The acquisition is dead." Furthermore, as a major voting bloc, Attic Investments is calling for an immediate vote of no confidence in Caldwell and Hayes' legal representation. "We will be moving our corporate counsel to Brooks and Associates, effective immediately." Thomas collapsed backward into his leather executive chair. His breathing was shallow, rapid. The millions he had leveraged, the debts he had accrued banking on this specific, massive commission, it was all gone. He had built his entire financial house of cards on this single deal. He looked at me, his eyes wide, terrified, and utterly defeated. He finally saw the 28-year-old woman he had let die in a hospital room, staring back at him through the eyes of the daughter he had thrown away. "Why?" he whispered, stripped of all his power, reduced to a desperate, broken man. I leaned forward, planting my hands on the mahogany table. "Because," I said softly, ensuring the words carried only to him, "the attic was cold, Thomas. And I told you, I would take everything else." The collapse of the Harding dynasty was not a loud explosion. It was a slow, agonizing suffocation. When the Aethelgard deal fell through in such a spectacular public fashion, the blood in the water attracted the sharks. Thomas had over-leveraged his personal assets to buy into commercial real estate that was tanking. He was relying on the massive acquisition commission to cover his margins. When the commission vanished, the banks called in his loans. Within 48 hours of the boardroom execution, Caldwell and Hayes, terrified of the liability and the sheer embarrassment of their senior partner being legally dismantled by a 16-year-old girl, forced Thomas into early, uncompensated retirement. They stripped him of his equity, citing a breach of fiduciary duty for failing to secure the voting blocks properly. By November, the foreclosures began. I watched it happen from the comfort of Ruth's penthouse. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I merely observed the natural consequences of their own hubris. Margaret Harding fought the hardest. She tried to maintain the illusion of their wealth, throwing a lavish holiday party that December. Half the guests didn't show up. The catering check bounced. By January, the bank seized the Mercer Island estate, the sprawling mansion with the heavy oak doors, the pristine yellow nursery, and the drafty, spider-infested attic. They were forced to downsize to a cramped, two-bedroom apartment in a decidedly unglamorous suburb. Margaret, stripped of her designer clothes and her high society status, spiraled into a bitter, resentful depression. She refused to leave the apartment, incapable of facing the women she had once lorded over. Isabella's reality check was the most violent. At 18, Isabella had been banking on a massive trust fund payout to fund her lifestyle of reckless partying and designer indulgence. When she discovered the trust had been drained by Thomas in a desperate bid to cover his real estate debts, she threw a tantrum that resulted in the police being called to their new apartment. Without the Harding money to shield her, Isabella's eccentricities were suddenly just common crimes. She was arrested for driving under the influence in late February. Thomas couldn't afford the high-priced fixers anymore. She spent a weekend in county jail, a stark, brutal wake-up call that shattered her delusions of grandeur. It was during a rainy Tuesday in March that Noah appeared. Noah, the man who had been my fiancé in my previous life, the man who had stood beside my sister, cutting a wedding cake while I died alone. In this timeline, he was a 22-year-old junior analyst at a competing firm. He had dated Isabella briefly before the money ran out, but had quickly abandoned ship when the Harding name became toxic. He managed to track down my private office. My secretary let him in, assuming he was a courier. Noah walked into my office, looking exactly as I remembered him. Handsome, slick, with a smile that promised the world and delivered nothing. "Claire," he said, turning on the charm, leaning against the doorframe, or should I say, the mysterious architect of attic investments. "I have to admit, what you did to Thomas was brilliant, ruthless. I like it." I didn't look up from my laptop. I let him stand there for a full minute, the silence stretching until his confident smile began to falter. "Can I help you, Noah?" I finally asked, my voice devoid of any emotion. He stepped into the room, trying to project intimacy. I just thought, well, considering the shift in the family dynamics, Isabella and I are no longer seeing each other. She's a mess, frankly. But you're something else entirely. I'd love to take you to dinner. Pick the brain of the most dangerous investor in Seattle. I looked at him. Really looked at him. I saw the opportunist, the parasite, the man who had abandoned a dying woman for a wealthier, healthier sister and was now trying to jump ship again to the winning side. "Noah," I said softly, closing my laptop, "do you know what the difference is between a poor investment and a toxic asset?" He blinked, thrown off by the question. "I suppose a poor investment just loses money. A toxic asset infects the rest of the portfolio." "Exactly," I said. I pressed the intercom button on my desk. "Security? We have a trespasser in the executive suite. Please escort him out and ensure his face is added to the building's ban list." Noah's face turned bright red, a mix of humiliation and anger. "Excuse me? I came here to offer you an olive branch." "You're a teenager, Claire. You can't just treat people like this." "I treat people exactly as their value dictates," I replied, standing up and turning my back to him, staring out the window at the rain. "Your value is zero. Goodbye, Noah." As the security guards dragged a sputtering, furious Noah out of my office, I felt a final, profound weight lift off my chest. I had purged the last ghost of my past life. The slate was completely clean. 12 years passed. I was 28 years old. It was late November, a cold, crisp Tuesday evening. The exact date, the exact time, and the exact age I had been when my heart had stopped beating in that sterile hospital room in my previous life. But this time, I wasn't in a hospital. I was standing on the grand staircase of the newly inaugurated Ruth Harding Pediatric Cardiology Wing at Seattle General Hospital. The hospital had desperately needed funding for an advanced surgical unit. I had fully funded it, on the condition that the Harding name specifically, my grandmother's name, was plastered in gold lettering above the entrance. Grandma Ruth had passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 years prior, at the age of 94. She had left me everything: her fortune, her company, and her unyielding spirit. She had been the mother I never had, the partner I had needed, and the architect of my survival. I missed her with a fierce, burning ache. But it was a clean grief, unmarred by betrayal. The gala was in full swing below me. The city's elite mingled, sipping champagne, praising the sheer philanthropy of attic investments. I wore a stunning, deep sapphire gown. My heart, a heart that had been perfectly healthy since the day I woke up in that 4-year-old body, beat with a strong, steady rhythm. I descended the stairs, nodding to the mayor, shaking hands with the chief of surgery. As I moved toward the exit, needing a breath of fresh air, I saw them. They weren't on the guest list. They couldn't afford a ticket to an event like this. They were standing outside the heavy glass doors, huddled under the awning to escape the freezing drizzle. Thomas and Margaret Harding. They looked decades older than they were. Thomas's posture was hunched, his expensive suits replaced by a worn, off-the-rack coat that was fraying at the cuffs. The arrogance had been entirely bled out of him, leaving only a hollow, exhausted shell. Margaret stood beside him, her hair completely grey and unkempt, staring blankly at the wealthy guests inside. They were holding a small, crumpled flyer, an advertisement for a free public health screening. The hospital was running, in conjunction with the gala. I stopped, just inside the glass doors. I was mere feet away from them. Thomas looked up. His eyes met mine through the glass. For a second, the years seemed to melt away. He was the towering, terrifying figure of my childhood, and I was the small, worthless mistake locked in the attic. But then reality reasserted itself. I was standing in a hospital wing I had bought, draped in wealth and power, glowing with life. He was a broken man standing in the rain, waiting for a free health screening. I saw his hand twitch. I saw his mouth open slightly, as if he wanted to speak, to beg, to apologize. I saw the desperate, humiliating hope in his eyes that maybe, after all these years, his daughter might show him a fraction of the mercy he had denied her. I looked at him. I felt no anger. I felt no hatred. I felt the most devastating emotion a child can ever direct at a parent. Absolute, profound apathy. I didn't smile. I didn't sneer. I simply looked through him, as if he were a smudge on the glass. I turned on my heel, the silk of my gown sweeping across the floor, and walked back into the warmth and light of my own life, leaving them permanently in the cold, dark world they had built for themselves. The heart monitor from my past life had finally stopped echoing in my head. I was alive. I was free. And I was never, ever looking back. If this story of ultimate revenge, rebirth, and reclaiming your destiny kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Claire's journey from a discarded child to a ruthless mastermind proves that sometimes the best revenge is a massive, untouchable success. What would you do if you woke up in your 4-year-old body with all your adult memories? Would you forgive? Or would you take everything? Drop your master plans in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with someone who loves a perfectly executed karma strike. And smash that subscribe button for more epic, real-life drama and storytelling. See you in the next one.